So Arad, he's the founder and CEO of Galaxia, a space and defense as a service company pioneering intelligent systems, spacecraft manufacturing, and in-orbit data solutions for government and commercial missions. Galaxia is redefining future connectivity and Earth observation through its proprietary software-defined satellite technology and edge computing platforms, enabling faster, smarter decision-making from orbit. Galaxia is an Atlantic, Canada-based company as well, so that's also incredible. Arad's a vocal advocate for Canadian sovereign space industry, championing the development of independent capabilities, and so much more. In addition to leading Galaxia, Arad founded the Pulsar Institute, a national not-for-profit advancing space education and cultivating Canadian future space workforce. He also co-leads the Logics, a trusted cybersecurity firm serving defense and commercial sectors across Atlantic Canada. And we'll move on to Mr. Robbins. Mark Robbins. Mark is an entrepreneurial public servant in the Government of Canada, working with the Department of National Defence. He spent his career working in the innovation and emerging technology space, not only as a public servant, but also as a think tank advisor to governments and as a professional researcher. So Mark believes that we face a moment of great opportunity to make an exciting and positive future through the embrace of emerging and disruptive technologies. We've had the great opportunity to work with Mark in part as well, and he's excited to go to work every day because of the privileges he gets to peek at the future and so much more. Some of his greatest achievements to date include creating well-respected and influential research on innovation policy, contributing to the government's perspective on the rapid growth of emerging technologies like drones and artificial intelligence, and perhaps most importantly, he's been able to roll up his sleeves and get in the trenches with amazing startups. And finally, Kiernan, very excited to have you here as well. Thank you for coming. Dr. Kiernan McClelland is a research associate in the Department of Global Studies at the Universidad Anáhuac in Mexico City. Apologies for the mispronunciation. Instructing in space policy and space security. Dr. McClelland served as a policy analyst with Transport Canada, Canadian Space Agency in space utilization policy. And he also provided policy and regulatory advice on commercial space launch in Canada. So prior to joining the Government of Canada, he worked as a consultant with Space Strategies Consultant, where he provided strategic and business advice on horizontal takeoff space launch systems. He holds a PhD in political science from Carleton University. So incredible brain power and experience on this panel, and a lot of really interesting perspectives from satellite side, history, policy, and innovation. So I think we'll start with some very quick opening remarks, if possible. Talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on the commercialization of space, sovereign space in Canada in general, and then we'll dig into some really specific questions. So maybe Mark, if you wanted to kick us off, that'd be great.
Thank you. So I like to describe my job as being responsible for taking the culture, practices, agility, and innovations of places like Silicon Valley and startup culture and piping them into the slow, drab, kind of boring, tedious world of government. Or as Rahul might use his own vocabulary for, I'm an individual in the blob who's responsible for making the blob a bit less of a blob. I think that this dynamic between bridging the gap between those two sectors is crucial to understand for not only space in a relationship between government and private industry, but also, frankly, because so much of what's been happening in the space sector has been a disruption of traditional incumbents in the aerospace sector by startups and scale-ups. I want to throw out a couple stats to help us better understand the sector as we're looking at it. So in 2019, and from 2019 to 2023, the amount of cargo that humanity launched into space quadrupled. So a 400% increase in 4 years. Of that increase, almost all of it took place with private industry, or by private industry, rather than government. Now, the summary of the space sector often stops right there, and is usually accompanied with something like, oh, well, government's slow and tedious, and industry's so dynamic, we should just have more industry. And while I don't necessarily disagree, I think that oversimplifies things in a way that is not necessarily helpful. A couple stats you might not have heard about the space industry. Of that increase in volume, almost all of it took place in the private space industry in the United States. And of the amount that took place in the private space industry in the United States, almost all of it took place by SpaceX. So if we want to talk about unloading and unlocking some of the potential of the space sector, we really have to understand what's going on with a company like SpaceX. It represents 70% of all the things that humanity launches into space every year. Or to put it differently, it puts almost 3 times more things into space than every government and private industry entity combined. Now, SpaceX is a private company. It is not publicly traded, so we don't have full information about its financials the way we do for some other companies. But we do know that it has received to date $22 billion from the US government, and that its second biggest client is Starlink, which is part of the same kind of corporate family. Starlink is, of course, publicly traded, so we know exactly where its revenue comes from. 50% of its revenue comes from the US government. 40% of its revenue, or its cost structure, comes from investments, and 10% actually comes from commercial sales to clients. So we're not really talking about private industry as we normally think of it. We're talking about public-private partnership. And I would go as far as to say that when your public-private partnership is that public, it might actually merit its own vocabulary. So just to be controversial for a second, universities in Ontario are 50% publicly funded, 50% privately funded. Hospitals, which we consider to be very much public institutions, receive 75% of their funding from government and 25% from private sector. Now, we don't know exactly where SpaceX is in that, but these are the waters we're swimming in. We don't necessarily have to think that we need to replicate that model to be successful, but we do need to understand that for this sector to be successful in Canada, it has to be done in a sort of joint partnership. And I think there's a lot more to that partnership than just the transfer of funds. If Mark Carney came in here today, he's got a day off because he's been working the election, he's taken it personal, and he puts a check for $100 million up on the dais, like, are we done? Do we just go home, watch the Sens beat the Leafs in Game 5? Surely not. That's preposterous. We still have a lot of work to do, and we can watch the Sens beat the Leafs after working hours. But I would just say, one of the things I'd like us to think about in these conversations is, what do the non-financial parts of that partnership look like, and what do they feel like?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. Quick remarks from Kiernan and Arad. Maybe Kiernan, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Raul, for the invitation. Buenos tardes, everyone. I want to kind of paint a picture in terms of the history, and I know it's weird to see a historian on this stage, but certainly given the venue, there's a lot of lessons that can be learned in the application of modern space activities in Canada. Any discussion on Canadian space history, of course, begins with the satellite, or replica, which is on display over there. In September 1962, the launch of Alouette 1, marking Canada as the third nation in the world to launch a satellite into space, or to place a satellite into space. From this point, the Canadian space program experiences several changes of vision, getting to the end of the Cold War period, many of which involve this sort of foundational question surrounding the role of rockets and the upper atmosphere in the attainment of Canadian policy objectives. What I hope to discuss today and really kind of focus on is how this rationale has changed and how a number of the debates that we are currently having in terms of sovereign launch capability, in terms of the need for political and financial support, elements related to the role of science in supporting these sorts of activities, how this narrative has adapted over the years and has been used by those organizations to try and bring space launch to Canada. Because make no mistake, space launch is an activity that has seen some support, or at least has attempted to see some support within Canada since the beginning of the Cold War. I mean, any sort of conversation we have about space launch has to start with the Black Brants, especially in Canada. 1962, Black Brant 5 had, for the most part, been tested, and the decision was on the federal government for what to do next. Alouette had just launched, and the question now was, how would Canada develop its satellite launch capability? Would it develop a satellite launch capability? This conversation is brought forward to Cabinet with 3 potential proposals. One, which now we would call a status quo option, would be to continue use of the Black Brants and to focus on scientific space research. The other, tying to work being completed by McGill University, was tied to the high altitude research project, the space cannon, the HARP gun. And the third was one which would see some modest support within the government of Canada, and that was focusing on a larger capability, but one that was derived from US capability, so development of the Scout rocket specifically. What ultimately occurs over the course of several debates, discussions amongst ministers, experts, launch operators, is the recognition that Canada should focus on what it's good at, especially in terms of space launch. So there was a focus during this period not to support the Scout mission, but rather to focus on what Canada was good at, developing the Black Brant and launching space science assets. And of course, subsequently, certain political and financial support was removed from those other alternatives. But what is interesting to note in terms of this very early exercise in Canada's space launch history is that this decision, for all intents and purposes, had already been made. The Chapman Report, the Upper Atmosphere Study #1, which is considered by people as the foundational document of Canada's early space program, had 3 recommendations. One focused on developing a national space agency a la NASA, focusing on domestic satellite communications to serve as a strategic backbone, a necessary strategic and national security requirement for Canada. And the third was the development of Indigenous launch. However, the report further explains that this sort of commitment to Indigenous launch was limited to a certain extent. Harley Zimmerman, the former Defense Research Board chair, said it best. There is no need for a launch capability, a satellite launch capability to place objects into polar orbit. It does not exist with the primary client at this point being the Government of Canada, and other sort of efforts should be focused on. So let's put a pin in that. Moving on to sort of the second period of these activities, we see, of course, the Churchill rocket range is sort of kept open. Eventually, due to financial cuts, it closes in 1984, leading to its leasing to Actuate Aerospace in 1994. Actuate Aerospace sold itself as the first Canadian commercial space launch port, again focusing on that critical market of small satellites into a polar orbit. 1995, the company signed an arrangement with a Russian-based company, STI Aerospace, for the leasing of non-militarized ICBM rockets to launch from Churchill. Obviously, this saw a bit of backlash in terms of the response and the application to Canada's sort of foreign policy interests. Canada is, of course, a non-proliferation state. And subsequently, the project sputters for a number of years until 1998, when it launches, I think 27 years yesterday, August 28th, 1998, a CSA payload. And then it goes bankrupt. And lastly is the curious case of Da Vinci, the Da Vinci project. And I think Da Vinci projects are not really a well-known space launch activity in Canada, but it's one that is very notable in terms of where we find ourselves today. Da Vinci was a company based out of Toronto, which was participating in the Ansari X Prize for $10 million to place a private citizen into space by an agreed-upon date. This was a project that saw considerable provincial support from the government of Saskatchewan and federal support in terms of launch authorization for a Rocketoon concept, including a balloon license and a high-altitude rocket launch license, to launch from middle of nowhere, Saskatchewan. I can say it's middle of nowhere and nothing's there because I'm from the prairies, so there's kind of that. The project continues, the deadline for launch is set, however, nothing comes to fruition. And eventually, it dissolves as well. And so I guess the 3 points I kind of want to get across in terms of our topic of how does the commercial space launch impact Canadian space industry. 3 historical points to hoist. First and foremost, political financial support is a driver and is also an inhibitor in terms of the success of these activities, especially in Canada. However, there are also 2 additional impacts that have long limited the ability of Canada to have a space launch capability. The first is the role of entities in communicating and delivering space launch vehicles and tampering expectations. Because if we go back to the Spaceport Canada example, the original idea was going to be an ICBM, right? A larger rocket. And what they got at the end of the day was a black brand. So that's an important consideration. And lastly, the question of being able to launch assets is absolutely critical for supporting that in the Canadian context. If you don't have assets to launch, or the particular entity that you're trying to sell these services to are not really concerned or interested in what you're selling, we've seen in the Canadian case that these activities have an issue with clients and ultimately sputter. So 3 high-level things to format the conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. That history actually goes into a question I was going to ask you anyway. So, Arad, maybe feel free to linger on your response as well. Talk to us about sovereign space, but also with your next mission coming up next year, which is obviously not launching on a Canadian vehicle. Like, how do you contextualize the future of your company, and what would sovereign launch mean to Galaxia and yourself?
So that mission that we have is actually coming up in June. It is flying on SpaceX, and we, because of the tariffs, that was a very good example of that. We ran into a lot of issues with that because last minute we got a letter from SpaceX imposing a 25% tariff on our launch, which doesn't make sense. You're not importing the spacecraft into the United States. Why are you paying tariff on it? But it's SpaceX. What are you going to do about it? It got to a point that we actually looked around. We turned around. We were like, okay, we're going to pull out of the mission a month before launch, and we started looking at other options. We wanted to see, okay, like if we don't pay SpaceX, number one, your money is gone. Everything you've paid for obviously gone. They're not going to give you your money back. But the very interesting thing about it is like there are no other options for it. Right? If you want to even, you're talking about Rocket Lab, but as many of you might know, it's not as easy as just, picking up the phone and be like, hey, I want to launch next month. So you're going to go on a manifest, and best case scenario might be on an 18-month schedule. So I don't think anyone in this room is really arguing with the fact that we do require sovereign capabilities. I'm one of those people, at this point, I'm kind of tired of it. I'm like, why are we even sitting here talking about it? Why don't we have our launch capabilities 5 years ago or even 10 years ago? When we started, so Galaxia started in 2021. We've had a rapid growth since then. We launched our first satellite in 2023. Next one is going on in June, and we have 3 satellites for the next year, another 2 for the years after that. One key element of that is when we started looking at that, one of my favorite ones was I was really hoping to launch with the Virgin Orbit. We started talking to them. We got into contracting phase, in fact, because I love 747s, and we got to a point that we said, can you fly it into Quebec? And we can fly it out of Quebec for the first time, launching Canadian payloads out of Canada. Of course, they go bankrupt. And then so we started looking at SpaceX now. But so my point is, I don't think anybody's arguing with the fact that we do require these sovereign capabilities. Why do we not have it? We know the answer to that. We are a very risk-averse nation. We do not like changes. And I think that kind of trickles down from the government down, because we are based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. One of the things that I went through at the very beginning of this, I wanted to do space. every single person I talked to from 2015, they said, like, you're crazy, you want to do a space company in Halifax. They're to some extent right. It's a hell to go through to do that in Canada, and further to that, to do it in Atlantic Canada, where there is absolutely no infrastructure in place. The policies are not there. The government is just not even familiar with that environment. But when we are talking about sovereign capabilities, I think we have to kind of really look at it as, what does that really mean? Are we just talking about launch, or are we talking about an entire ecosystem? So launch is very important. We don't have launch right now. It's kind of a crazy idea, as if like a nation doesn't have an airport or doesn't have basically a ship port, you know? Like, how do we even live with that? And when we look at all the advanced nations, most of the Western G7 countries, as well as everybody talked about it, they're all working on 3-4 fronts, and here we are sitting talking about, okay, can we maybe have a spaceport by 2030? And it's just like kind of crazy. So yeah, we got to kind of look at that sovereign capabilities. Like, can we also build the capabilities here? I feel like there will be a shift in how we will manufacture spacecrafts down the road. I feel like as the technology miniaturization is becoming a thing, it would be very difficult for some of the bigger companies to justify a $2-3 billion cost point for a constellation, whereas the small new space companies, you've got ISI, you've got Planet, they are doing these at a fraction of the cost. So we will see a huge demand in the launch market over the next decade for sure. And we need to support the entire ecosystem in Canada, everywhere from the ideation all the way to manufacturing the capabilities, launching them, operating them. But again, we do need to build those, and the government policies are obviously number one key point there.
Yep, agree with everything you said there, Arad. So I think what I'd like to do maybe is just ask some targeted questions to each of the three of you that are a little bit more specific to your unique areas. And so, Mark, I mean, bouncing off what Arad said, we need this yesterday, basically, 10 years ago. You focused on identifying innovative companies. This is a technology that's been developed now almost over 100 years ago. We've had rockets being developed, even liquid rockets. How critical is innovation in developing this capability in Canada versus just building what we know works and getting this capability working in Canada? Where do you sort of draw the line between innovation going too far for a capability we need yesterday versus something that's very greenfield, very new, where innovation does matter a lot?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so for most government procurement, especially for things in the defense sector, there is an emphasis on reliability, scalability. Like, we're not buying ones and twos of things that are brand new and super exciting. We're usually buying like thousands of things, and you know, the warfighter needs to make sure that they all work the same way, or else we have a bigger problem, right? So that breeds this culture of like, we value consistency and repeatability and fitting up to specific requirements more than we value innovation. And I don't have to like tell you that that doesn't really work anymore. I mean, goodness, just look at the state of the global defense sector. Look what's happening in Ukraine. Like, you largely read the same news that I do. It's quite plain that you need to be innovative now to actually get the warfighter the things that they require to do their job. So on the balance of, do we value consistency more than innovation? I would say that historically it has been consistency more than innovation, but now I would view being an innovative supplier as a fundamental prerequisite to being a supplier to the defense sector.
I guess just a quick follow-up on that. You know, if you look at the global market, launch is fairly commoditized. In a warfighting scenario where you're looking for that asymmetry, maybe innovation is critical. For a commoditized capability, does that equation change at all, or do you still feel innovation sort of trumps building something that is highly reliable or a proven fundamental technology?
Yeah, no, I think I see your point. I mean, ultimately, startups and scale-ups work in the 80% solution environment, right? Like, the first 80% is the part that you can do. The last 20% is extremely hard. Government tends to purchase on like Six Sigma requirements. So we want everything to kind of work perfectly and consistently. And I think really where we're at is that for space launch and for many of the other technologies in the defense sector, we have to meet each other a little bit closer to halfway. Like government needs to be a little bit tolerant of less than 6 sigma reliability. It needs to own a bit more of the risk in terms of the functionality of things which are not yet proven and have not been used yet regularly. But similarly, when we're talking with private industry, whether it be NerdSpace or anybody else, people need to be able to come to us and say, look, the brochure says we're a 100% solution, we're maybe a 90% solution. And I'm okay with that. Like, if you tell me you're a 90% solution, I'm like, okay, let's get at it. Like, what do you need to get to that next percent? Like, I need to be able to buy what you guys are trying to create. That would be one of the dynamics I think that we need in this whole partnership in the sector, is that openness to be able to collaborate on those things, because government has a lot more to offer than just money. Like, we're not only a bank. Like, Department of National Defense is the single biggest residential real estate holder in the country. Bet you didn't know that. We've got thousands of scientists. We've got lots of everything. And I think collaboration is going to be the way for us all to get what we need.
Cool. That sounds great. Arad, if I could just go to you real quick. Can you paint us a picture of what you think a sovereign end-to-end capability will look like? You're based in Nova Scotia, spaceport being built there, Newfoundland as well. What does this look like? And suppose we get our act together, investment, technology development, capability development. What's your ideal scenario from completing your satellite to getting it launched in an orbit? What does that physically and logistically look like to you in the Canadian context?
One of the reasons that I was very focusing and trying to stay in Nova Scotia was the fact that I think we really need that diversification of how to geographically spread out our space industry. I mean, the key point to that, to your point, is like we are kind of looking at the spaceport Nova Scotia, the spaceport in Newfoundland. So what do you need around that? You need a vertical integration facility. You need these companies that build the satellites. But then when you kind of go back, where are these requirements of these satellites or spacecrafts come from? And that almost goes back into a downstream data solutions. We have a lot of those in Canada. We have a lot of downstream companies that are using satellite data and doing things with it, which is great. It's a great export because it's very cheap to do. We don't have a lot of other capabilities to do that. So the problem with that is the moment a country decides to close the tap on us, we are in deep trouble. An example of that would be just, again, now, if a country decides that they do not want to sell very specific, let's say, attitude determination control systems or communication systems for spacecraft. We can't build our satellites if we do not have these capabilities. So what I see is, again, not just one company that builds satellites for Canada. We need a whole bunch of different companies that have capabilities to build these subsystems and provide it into one unique system, and then being able to launch it and be able to operate it.
Yep, fantastic. Looking forward to that future as well. And finally, maybe just a quick response, Kiernan. We're running up on time here. You probably know more about the history of launch than pretty much anyone I know in Canada, which is really cool and unique. What do you think of the modern era? Like where we're at right now, the way we're thinking about launch, the few companies working on it, the current political and regulatory landscape compared to what you saw before? Do you have a higher degree of confidence that we're going to get it right this time? And any key lessons you think from the past that we really want to make sure we pay attention to?
Yeah, so I mean, this isn't any surprise to anyone, but fundamentally the environment has shifted. The strategic landscape for global space launch is fundamentally different than what it was during the periods I've listed. Even in the early 2000s, the activities were, we are in a post-Falcon 9 world. Mm-hmm. Basically, and so as a result of that, certainly there are a lot of other sort of external factors we have to consider, some of which are within our power to control as public-private partners. But on the other hand, there are certainly some sort of other factors that may have a role in impacting this industry and the success of initiatives moving forward. The one that I'm often reminded of by my students in Mexico, where this discussion is very much a new conversation of what is the role of a space agent, what is the role of a new space agency in facilitating space launch, is environmental space sustainability. Presumably as the number of launches increases, the number of objects in space will also increase, and that has certain implications. But I am hopeful for the future. Why? Because we, especially here in Canada, industry is developing incredibly innovative and policy, I think, driven solutions. One that I certainly like to focus on in my studies, at least, is biofuel. This is an area where Canada excels in. We are the primary user and manufacturer of renewable biofuel in the world. We have several academic institutions that are doing high-level credibility research on the impacts of biofuel and its use in space launch activities. So I think in terms of where we go from here, going back to my history analogy, we're in a space race, yes, fine. But I think Canada is well positioned to win this space race in such a way that we have the resources, we have the technology, we certainly have the talent, and again, this is a comment for the Government of Canada representatives in the room, there is a drive as well to push these activities.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time and commitment to this panel and event. Please join me in thanking Kiernan and Arad and Mark.